Hello everyone. Okay then. So I hope you managed to sort out those new Labour and old Labour, those new Labour policies into which ones old Labour would have been happy with, and which ones they wouldn't. And hopefully you can see that there's a bit of a mix there. Despite New Labour talking quite a lot, about accepting the market and dynamism and the new clause 4 and all of that. There were actually quite a few old Labour things in there which old Labour would have been happy with. Some of the things New Labour, I won't say kept quiet about, they didn't overly emphasise some of those old Labour things they were doing. For example, New Labour did quite a lot to try and deal with like child poverty and stuff. They did mention it, but it wasn't like a real big thing in terms of what they really talked about all the time, because I think they felt that has smacks of old Labour and therefore might not be very popular with the public. Now, obviously, when we looked at the Conservatives, we had a look, didn't we, about to what extent is the modern Conservative Party still kind of dominated by the ideas of Thatcherism. And there's a key phrase to all this, it's called consensus. And this is the idea that when the two main parties fundamentally agree with each other. So, for example, between 1945 and the mid-70s, there was a consensus between Labour and the Conservatives where they fundamentally agreed about key aspects of how the country was run in terms of, the private and the mixed economy with some nationalised industries, some private industries. You saw in this period like foreign policy against the Soviet Union was kind of similar from both parties. You could argue that Mrs. Thatcher also created a consensus when she left office, because one or two people said that New Labour was kind of her greatest achievement because they took on many Thatcherite ideas. What I'm going to do, I'm going to put on now a little video. This is a series called Tory, and it was done about 2006. And it's really good, actually. The first episode of the series, I'll put the links on, and I might have in the Conservative Party section. But you always look on YouTube, just type in Tory, and you'll find it. Episode 1's really good, actually, about think tanks and where some of Mrs. Thatcher's key ideas originally came from, and how a fairly small group of people with these ideas of free markets wanted to get rid of that consensus, that one nation conservatism idea, if you like. How they tried to get, like Mrs. Thatcher and stuff on board. And she's quite good talking about think tanks and stuff. Anyway, the very last, literally 6 minutes of the last episode, kind of discusses New Labour in relation to Thatcherism. As I said, this was made in Tony Blair's last year of office, this video. So I'll show you this last little bit. It is actually quite interesting. Well, I think it is anyway. Okay, so here we go.
On Wednesday, 28th of November 1990, Mrs. Thatcher left Downing Street for the final time.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're leaving Downing Street for the last time after 11 and a half wonderful years.
I was fantastically depressed. The excitement of working with her was extraordinary. You never knew what was going to happen day from day. And suddenly the whole game was over.
I would bet you anything you like that most of our own members of Parliament that day were saying to themselves, what on earth have we done? Why have we got rid of this woman?
It's been a tremendous privilege.
When she went,
to serve this
it was kind of, you just felt people walking on air. It was just different. She'd gone. She was terrific. She gave us the medicine. We took the medicine. It was painful. It was awful. But she's gone. Thank God.
Although the Tory party held on to power for 7 more years, it was critically wounded. The party was traumatised by the political assassination of its most charismatic leader since Churchill. The Conservatives took to infighting and lost their political direction.
The very people who withheld their support from her on grounds that you couldn't win a subsequent election with her were ultimately responsible for sending the Conservative Party into the wilderness for, electorally speaking, for 15 or 20 years. And the Tory party has suffered the repercussions ever since.
Some say the real beneficiaries of Thatcherism have been New Labour, revamped and repackaged under Tony Blair.
But you've got to remember that Tony Blair admired Thatcher to bits. When he became Prime Minister, she was the first person he invited to Downing Street, 2 weeks after becoming there, before he invited any Labour grandee, before he invited Michael Foot, Neil Kinnock, anyone. He invited Margaret Thatcher to Downing Street. She admires him, he admires her. They are birds of the same feather.
Such nations aren't built by dreamers. They rise by the patient courage of the change maker. And that's what we've been in New Labour, change makers. And that is how we must stay.
To Maggie's admirers, it's not just about style. They say it's also about substance. Tony Blair looked at what made Labour unelectable. And it was Clause 4, it was the whole of state ownership, it was dependence on the trade unions. He ditched all that.
I think that Tony Blair has reaped the benefits of Thatcherism because he has not really reversed anything. He hasn't renationalised anything. He hasn't fundamentally changed the trade union legislation. It's all accepted.
Though Thatcherites may see their reflection on both sides of the Commons, New Labour and the lady herself are not so sure.
I suspect that Maggie Thatcher, in her less kind moments, would regard it as being an obscenity to compare Thatcherism with Tony Blair. Notice, not Blairism. There is no such thing as Blairism.
Blairites might disagree, but Thatcherites now believe their policies define the centre ground.
All the major things that we fought for in the 1980s are now accepted as sensible policies by our political opponents. I mean, that is a revolution in politics if ever there was one.
Mrs. Thatcher may be long out of Downing Street, but her shadow still falls long over the British political landscape.
Okay then, so I hope you all enjoyed that. So you can see there that those Conservatives saying that basically Mrs. Thatcher has now been accepted, her ideas are now part of a consensus. All the main parties fundamentally agree with Thatcherism. Or at least you might say now with hindsight that was true perhaps until Jeremy Corbyn became leader later on. Now what I'd like to do is just have a think about that video and some of those Conservatives there saying that Tony Blair was basically just Mrs. Thatcher. However, judging by that work you've just done in your booklet, where you had to put policies of New Labour which Old Labour would have liked, and which were not Old Labour, go through them, put a T by the ones which you think Mrs. Thatcher would have liked, and make your own conclusion, your own judgment about actually was New Labour kind of Thatcherism with a human face, or was it actually more in the model of Old Labour? So that's a judgment for you to make. And again, think about potential essays, about New Labour and Mrs. Thatcher, or about the view that Thatcher created a new consensus, something like that. Some of those ideas from New Labour, which Mrs. Thatcher would also have approved of, will fit into that type of essay. Okay, so the next video I'm going to make is going to move on to Jeremy Corbyn, and where he's taken Labour since he became Labour Party leader.